This video is the first episode in my upcoming series on the resurgence of fascism around the world. Since YouTube has an awful content flagging system and doesn't differentiate between videos speaking critically of things and those advocating for them, the rest of the series will be exclusive to a new platform called Rockfin. You can get access to that series and lots of other great radical content by following the link below. Let's do a little word association. I'm going to give you 3 words, and you decide whether each word has a generally good connotation or a bad one. Ready? Patriotism. Good. Fascism. Bad. Nationalism. Somewhere in the middle? This one depends on your perspective, but I'd guess about 60 or 70% of you would say nationalism has a bad connotation. While each of these 3 isms is animated by a pride in one's country, they exist on a spectrum of increasing animosity towards others. Enough pride in your own country could very easily lead you to be frustrated with the perspectives of other countries, and without even being aware of it, you've slipped from patriotism into nationalism. Enough frustration with other countries often leads to bitterness, distrust, and eventually to hatred, while your loyalty to your homeland only increases. That fierce loyalty to your own country and the animosity towards others is often enough to bring about the rise of fascism, the desire to bring the rest of the world under the rule of the one truly good nation. In this episode, we're going to discuss how patriotism is the gateway drug to nationalism, and under some circumstances, fascism. Before we begin, let's take a second to define these 3 terms so we're all on the same page. We'll start with patriotism. Patriotism is a love for and devotion to one's country. Nationalism expands on that, adding, especially, a sense of national consciousness exalting one nation above all others and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations. The distance between nationalism and fascism is much larger. Fascism is defined as a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. When placed on a spectrum, it's easy to see how someone could go from being a patriot to a nationalist without ever noticing the transition. It seems like it would be much more difficult to reach the stage where you're comfortable calling for authoritarian measures and decrying the inhumanity of different groups. But it's more common and far more insidious than you might think. Now, before we go any further, let me say that this video is not only about conservatives. Yes, fascism is a right-wing ideology, despite what some misguided conservatives would have you believe. But it's also about maintaining dominance over people who are deemed inferior. And no one is better at feeling superior than the United States. Our foreign policy is fascist whether a Democrat is in the White House or a Republican. It's only when those authoritarian tendencies are brought home that the average American begins to notice. This video is also not about the YouTube and 4chan radicalization pipeline. There have been plenty of videos on the subject, and I highly recommend this one by Innuendo Studios if you're interested. I'll mention YouTube eventually because it's something I'm very familiar with, but I want to focus on the radicalization of a group that's largely ignored, our parents' generation. The people born in the 60s and 70s who don't use the internet as much as we do, and are therefore paradoxically more isolated from and more vulnerable to far-right propaganda. The generally decent people who consume daytime TV and radio talk shows, but who probably have no idea who Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson are. As one final disclaimer before we begin, I want to address the conservative talking point that's bound to come up in the comments. The claim that leftists are actually the fascists. First of all, the people making these claims lump everyone from centrists to communists into the same category. Centrists and liberals are not the left. They have a lot more in common with conservatives than either group would care to admit. The claim that the left is fascist hinges upon the fact that there are some problems that are universally accepted, and that includes by both far-right extremists and socialists like me. Just about everybody, regardless of political opinions, can agree that the economy is in trouble and that the average Americans are being left behind by the increasingly wealthy elite. But acknowledgement of a problem is very different from agreeing on solutions. To the left, the solutions would be, at the very least, strengthening unions so that American workers have more bargaining power, and taxing the ultra-wealthy at a much higher rate. To the far right, the solutions are expelling immigrants, jailing political dissidents, and getting rid of the Jews who supposedly pull the strings of the nation's banks and media operations. Only one of these sets of solutions is fascist. Fascism can be pretty insidious. If you take Nazi Germany, for example, Hitler implemented modest social reform policies that could be considered left-wing, in America at least, but those policies came with the tiny little caveat that they had to eradicate an entire culture, plus any gays and communists they could catch for good measure. Fascism will always come bundled with racist, xenophobic, and violent ideology. It's part of the deal. With all those preliminary matters out of the way, let's meet our average 50-something suburban voter. Her name is Karen. Karen is a stay-at-home mom, probably has a designer dog, drives a mid-sized BMW or Mercedes SUV, and hasn't had to apply for a job since 1985. She watches Fox News, listens to conservative talk radio, and has no idea that she's become a meme. When Karen was growing up, the news was something you could watch in the morning or in the evening, and there were many fewer channels to choose from. The era of 24-hour news cycles and hundreds of channels wouldn't begin until 1994. During her formative years, Karen witnessed the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, the Wall Street crash of 1987, and the end of the Cold War. She saw the US take its place as the sole world superpower, and by the 90s, things had settled into a comfortable lull for the United States. Then, in 1996, a media mogul named Rupert Murdoch hired Roger Ailes to head up his new project, Fox News. This selection was very intentional. Roger Ailes had been active in both TV and politics for decades, acting as an aide and advisor for both the Nixon and George H.W. Bush administrations, coaching them on everything from what ties to wear to how to spin certain policies for the media. Ailes was a talented and devoted propagandist, and a master of media manipulation, and he had big plans for injecting the Republican Party into mainstream American thought. Years after his work constructing Fox News, a 318-page trove of documents was unearthed from the bowels of the Bush and Nixon presidential libraries. This collection, simply titled A Plan for Putting the GOP on TV News, dated back to the 1970s, and detailed Ailes' plan to build a pro-GOP news operation to be run out of and partially funded by the White House. Even back then, Ailes understood the potential for TV news. He said, "People are lazy. With television, you just sit, watch, listen. The thinking is done for you." When he was brought on for Fox News, Ailes chose not to hire experienced journalists, and instead constructed a team of inexperienced partisans he could count on to read his pro-GOP scripts. Ailes himself was rabidly homophobic, racist, and completely without journalistic integrity. Together with Rupert Murdoch, he built a faux news media empire that today is the most profitable in the country, in no small part thanks to Murdoch's massive investment to pay cable providers to air their network. This was unheard of. Normally, a cable company would pay networks to license their shows. Fox News did the opposite, buying their way into 25 million homes. Ailes praised Murdoch's move, saying, "This is capitalism and one of the things that made this country great." He was right about it being a pure expression of capitalism, but I think most reasonable people would disagree that being able to dominate the airwaves simply by virtue of your extreme wealth is a good thing. This is when the right-wing propaganda machine really took off. The pro-war, anti-union, anti-regulation party now had a dedicated state media outlet. Fox News immediately set to work branding themselves and the Republican Party as the ones looking out for average Americans, railing against the coastal elites and intellectuals, dressing themselves in patriotic imagery and declaring themselves defenders of freedom in the face of creeping socialism. These weren't new talking points, but putting it on TV for 24 hours a day was a new approach, and it worked. The key was not only selling themselves as the good guys, but casting everyone who was not them as the bad guys, people who were out to steal your freedom and invade your suburban oasis.
They're not satisfied with spreading the chaos and violence into our communities. They want to abolish the suburbs altogether. This forced rezoning would bring crime, lawlessness, and low-quality apartments into now thriving suburban neighborhoods.
Fox knew their market: nervous housewives, the uneducated, and the elderly. And that's not to say that Fox News viewers are stupid. It's an indictment on a predatory propaganda network that uses fear as a motivating tactic. Fox picked out the demographics that identified as proud Americans and set to work trying to convince these people that the others were coming to destroy everything that makes our country great. In this way, patriotism, the love and support for one's country, was twisted into a defensive position instead of a passive feeling. Democrats are trying to ban Christmas, buy our American flag blankets to show them real patriots aren't afraid, and on and on. But this doesn't explain how self-proclaimed patriots become nationalists. Sure, their patriotism has become warped and reactionary, but what causes the transformation? Long story short, time and the exploitation of traumatic events. Fox News has only been around for about 24 years. A lot of people my age can remember a time when their parents seemed less scared, less xenophobic. That's not just a natural change. That comes from them living in a time before Fox News and then suddenly being bombarded with fear-mongering and right-wing propaganda 24/7 for over 2 decades. Time can do a lot to normalize things, and many older people have simply accepted Fox News as a valid alternate perspective on reality, when its explicit goal from the very beginning was to act as a propaganda outlet. But time wasn't the only culprit in turning millions of patriotic Americans into spiteful nationalists. After 9/11, Fox News ramped up its pro-America, anti-foreigner rhetoric, feeding on the fear and uncertainty of this new era. Suddenly, all brown people were suspected terrorists, and of course we had to invade Iraq to bring them freedom and democracy. Even after it became common knowledge that we had started a war under false pretenses, Fox News and the new wave of conservative radio talk shows kept feeding their audience bad information, smearing the Middle East as a primitive hellhole, Europe as do-nothing socialists, and South America as full of failed states. The United States was the last bastion of truth and freedom in the world. Of course, these propagandists, including other news networks, left out some key details, like the fact that the US had destabilized the Middle East for generations, killed innocent civilians, including school children and people at a wedding, and captured and illegally tortured people in secret prisons. And that's just in the Middle East. American media will never report on the dozens of coups we've orchestrated in Latin America, overthrowing democratically elected governments and installing dictators like Pinochet. Fox may be the most obvious example, but news networks from CNN to ABC to CBS all play a critical role in maintaining the myth that America is the greatest, freest nation on earth. Since 2001, there has been a huge shift away from passive patriotism to active nationalism. But where news networks excel in putting out a polished, seemingly factual message, they lack one critical thing: the personal connection. Some talking heads get pretty close. Tucker Carlson has the "I'm just like you" act down to a science, despite the fact that he makes $6 million a year to parrot GOP talking points. Most news networks are big productions, lots of people, flashy graphics, very visual driven, and they can't travel with you on your commute. Talk radio hosts can. Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, Bill O'Reilly, Mark Levin, Newt Gingrich, all one-time Fox personalities who, for whatever reason, whether sexual assault or becoming too radical even for Fox News, have had to leave and start their own one-man shows on streaming radio, can go wherever you go. They can talk to you in your car on the way to work, or to get groceries, or to pick up little Tinsley from ballet. It's just you and them, one-on-one. No chyrons, no breaking news alerts, no boring weather updates. Just you, the host, and pure, uninterrupted ideology. When you consume content around other people, it's just entertainment or background noise. But when you're alone with the host, it becomes almost like a friendship. You feel like you know the person, like they're a trusted advisor. The more you listen, the more their ideology melds with your own. When there are no voices of dissent or alternate opinions, you begin to accept everything they say as fact. And that is very damaging. For older people, this is the equivalent of the YouTube fascism pipeline. On YouTube, a young person will watch a video by Joe Rogan, then will get recommended one by Steven Crowder, then Ben Shapiro, and then suddenly their homepage is full of the most baseless, toxic far-right content imaginable. For older people, it was watching news in the evening, then Fox News debuted and caught their attention, then the network got more radical and added extremist primetime hosts, then some of those hosts broke with the network and started their own shows, and now that extreme content is available whenever they need their fix of fear and anger. This is where we start to see the metamorphosis from nationalist to fascist. Traditional media gives you the shot, fear of other countries, followed by the chaser, American exceptionalist nonsense. Talk show hosts take it one step further and make you hate the people you fear. Muslims, black people, gay people, cultural Marxists or elites, which is often code for Jews. Antifa, immigrants. These subgroups are not only bad, they're actively working to dismantle America and steal your freedom. They'll often use tactics such as one I like to call Schrodinger's immigrant, where immigrants are simultaneously cast as both lazy welfare recipients and hyper-productive job stealers, or Antifa are described as both whiny snowflakes and terrorist super soldiers. This doublespeak is present in all instances of fascism throughout history. You have to make your people hate the enemy for their perceived moral failings, but also fear them. But while talk shows are an integral part in the patriotism to fascism pipeline, they're still missing the final piece of the puzzle, and that's a figurehead that functions as a cult of personality. I'm going to say a couple of things that some of you might disagree with. First, every president in modern history has wielded fascist power abroad. Trump is not the first one to do it. Second, I don't think that Trump has always had fascist tendencies. He's very thin-skinned and seems to have exceptionally malleable opinions. He's been molded by his base just as he has whipped them into a nationalist frenzy. They feed on each other in a vicious, ever-worsening feedback loop, to the point where now, the same people who fly "Don't Tread on Me" flags are calling for the police to conduct mass arrests on peaceful protesters and political dissidents. They're supposedly against authoritarianism, but they're calling for the government to use authoritarian measures to achieve their xenophobic goals. They celebrate the police using excessive force, completely oblivious to the fact that what they're applauding is in direct conflict with what they claim to oppose: oppressive government. When people move from loving America over all others, to hating all others because they're not America, to wanting to remove anything that doesn't comply with their warped sense of what America represents, they've moved from patriotism to nationalism all the way to fascism, and they may not have even noticed it happening. So, how do you spot a fascist? They typically hold inconsistent views about violence and government overreach. They're vocal about the groups they hate and fear. They want a white ethno-state. They support Donald Trump to the point where they applaud his suggestion of getting a third term. And they do things like this. Only in America could someone be so misguided that they think dressing up as the Statue of Liberty, a beacon of welcome to all people, and wearing a Make America Great Again mask while vandalizing a call for justice and equality is what it truly means to be great. It's hard to know how far along your loved ones are on this spectrum, and it's even harder to watch people you love turn into hateful shadows of their former selves. But a conversation could go a long way towards derailing that process. There are ways to tell if someone you care about has fallen into this pipeline. If they consume content that makes them feel attacked or marginalized by a different ethnic group, sexual orientation, or other immutable characteristics of other people, if those voices are calling for war or for the jailing of citizens for holding dissenting opinions, if those networks or personalities sell shady products like brain pills or useless powders, it's probably time to say something. There's no guarantee you can drag your loved ones back from this toxic whirlpool of propaganda and fear-mongering, but it's worth a shot. Every time fascism has arisen around the world, the people later reported thinking, it can't happen here. But it can happen. And it is. As I expected would happen, this video was instantly demonetized. It's an incredibly important topic, but since advertisers don't want to touch it, YouTube won't recommend this video. That's why I've decided to make the rest of this series exclusive to Rockfin. Rockfin is a new platform for monetizing content that would be suppressed on sites like YouTube. I want to keep making videos on timely and important topics like this one, but I also need to make a living, and I can't do that if YouTube keeps demonetizing my content. If you've been thinking about becoming a patron, consider trying Rockfin instead. You'll get access to all my political videos, including my exclusive series on the resurgence of fascism, but you'll also get access to other great radical creators like Richard Medhurst and Nico House, and their exclusive content. So really, it's like Patreon, except it supports not just me, but also other leftist channels like mine. You can make a Rockfin account completely free and get access to all the free content on the platform. But if you really want to help support me and other channels like mine, consider signing up for a paid membership. It's $10 a month, which is like 2 coffees, and it really does help me pay the bills and keep producing the radical content that needs to be made. Follow the link below to give Rockfin a shot, and you'll be helping me produce content to radicalize the next generation of organizers who will help us build a brighter future for all of us. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, consider subscribing to stay up to date with my latest episodes. If you hated it, go ahead and drop a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.